Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we're going to be giving you my updated best decks to play for ranked mode in the third week of this ED Crisis format. So there hasn't been a ton of stuff that has changed over the last few weeks in terms of what I believe the best decks to play are. We're going to showcase 7 of the top decks in my mind if you're playing in ranked battles, whether you're in Great Ball, Ultra Ball, looking to hit Master Ball, or you're looking to climb as high as possible in the Master Ball tier. These are going to be the top decks for you. In my opinion, of course, it's all subjective, based around data that we've got for tournaments, but also what other decks that people are playing at the top of, the Master Ball meta. That's kind of where we pull all of these decks from. Again, this is going to be a relatively short video. We've already spent some time talking about a lot of these decks, so I just wanted to go ahead and update you guys with maybe some of the cards or ways that people are playing these deck lists. So yeah, let's kind of get right into it, guys. The first deck is definitely going to be Silvali and Zeraora with Oricorio. I am kind of calling this deck Turbo Silvali, not to be confused with like Oricorio Silvali, because the main difference between those two versions of the deck is playing one Oricorio or two. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this because I think a lot of people kind of assume that maybe playing 2 Oricorio is better for the deck, because there are a lot of matchups where Oricorio is really good. But one thing I will say is that there's a lot of matchups that you're going to be going up against where Oricorio really isn't that valuable, especially as a leadoff Pokemon. That is the big reason why we are playing 2 Silvali, 2 Type Null, and 2 Zeraora, and only 1 Oricorio. Against mostly all of the other Silvali decks in the format, which, by the way, there are a lot, Oricorio is a relatively useless card. Now, some of the Silvali decks, like Silvali Charizard, are playing Charizard along with Silvali, so the main core of this deck is to be winning the Silvali mirror match, which we should be doing more often than not, and that's why it's a Turbo Silvali deck. Zeraora here with 1 copy of Dawn is really the strategy that we're employing for this deck to basically be more fast-paced and more consistent than the other Silvali decks. We are going to struggle against Silvali and Rampardos, but the big reason why I have been so high on this particular deck, and especially in the higher ranks, is where I think this deck is going to be better, is because less and less people are playing Silvali and Rampardos. So if you're in Great Ball or maybe Ultra Ball, this might not be the best option for you, considering there's probably still a lot of people playing Rampardos. That is one of the few decks that is, again, strong against us, but a variety of different decks Oricorio is really good against. In the Solgaleo matchup, or the Charizard matchup, or even Buzzwole and Gueritina Darkrai, even 1 copy of Oricorio should give you the advantage to win that game. And then other than that, we're just playing a really fast-paced, consistent Silvali deck. That's really the core here of the list. 2 Zeraora. Zeraora is really nice as a leadoff option. If you're going first, it acts as a free pivot because it does generate that 1 free energy with its ability. Or if we're going first and it's in the active spot, we can just attack on turn 2 for 50 damage. We also have Dawn, so if Zeraora is on our bench to start the game, it really is just sort of this energy battery that we can kind of utilize Dawn later in the game to set up another Pokemon relatively quickly and easily. Really fast-paced, very, very consistent deck here. In my mind, one of the best decks in the entire game. Certainly going to be good in the higher ranks where less people are playing Silvali Rampardos, but in my mind, it's still a very strong deck. I don't think much has changed in terms of how we're playing this deck list. This is kind of the same exact deck that I played in my video the other day. Also got 4th, I believe, at the Ursa Days tournament. 1 Pokemon Center Lady, 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina, 1 Dawn, 1 Mars, 1 Giovanni. Now, if you're not a big fan of Hand Disruption, which I do think is very good in the format, Dawn is definitely a card in this deck that you could potentially run 2 copies of. It is still a bit situational. Dawn isn't really a card that you're always going to have in the early game, and even if you do have it in the early game, there's never a guarantee that it's going to be that useful. So Dawn is honestly a little bit better as a mid to late game card. You really don't need 2 copies of it. I think 1 copy is correct. I would rather personally play 1 Mars, but I know some people would maybe cut Mars out of the deck. 1 Giant Cape, 1 Pokemon Center Lady. Those are kind of non-negotiable, especially in those matchups in the mirror matchup, to allow Silvali to, of course, live an attack from your opponent's Silvali, or also allow you to live an attack from things like Solgaleo or Buzzwole. We're typically attaching Giant Cape to Silvali, but there are some scenarios where that extra 20 HP along with Pokemon Center Lady is going to be enough to kind of put you over the top in the Oricorio strategy against some of those decks that maybe don't have a good answer to Oricorio. So anyway, here it is, guys. Same old list, very, very strong. If you're curious about some gameplay, I did, of course, make a video on this deck, and we did quite well on the ladder in about 4 or 5 games, so definitely go check out that video. Next up in this video is going to be another Silvali deck. We're going to just start off with all of these Silvali decks that I would recommend playing, and that's going to be Charizard EX. Now, the thing with Charizard EX is that it is honestly an inconsistent deck. Like, there's no guarantee that you're going to get into Charizard. You need to draw Charmander, you need to bench it, you have to draw into Rare Candy or Charizard. We are playing one copy of Charmeleon in this list. Now, the main strategy with this deck, of course, is leading with Silvali, maybe taking a KO or two, and then going into Charizard EX to finish the game. It doesn't always flow very properly. This is a deck that is a bit of a high roll deck, meaning it's not the most consistent deck in the world, but its potential is very, very high. So if you wanted to play a deck that just kind of could steamroll your opponent if you draw the right cards, this is kind of the deck for you. This is definitely the most common way that people are playing Charizard. I also made a video on this deck a couple of weeks ago. I think it was and is honestly at the moment one of the best hard counter decks in the game. We're going to be doing very well against Buzzwole as well as Solgaleo. That's really where Charizard shines. Certainly has a significant spot in the metagame right now. You are going to struggle in a variety of other matchups, but most of the time you're not going to be hitting Silvali and Rampardos. And if you do hit Silvali, Turbo Silvali or Electric type Silvali, that might be also an issue for you. But to be fair, you're going to win if you draw your cards. You're probably going to lose if you don't draw your cards. Charizard has always been the same. Even back towards the Genetic Apex days, it's always been sort of a high roll card, a sort of draw your cards and win. Don't draw your cards and you're not going to win type of deck here. Not a ton of strategy to be involved here. It is a bit of a linear deck, so it is easier to play, which is definitely an upside. Not too many supporter cards in this deck compared to other Silvali decks, which does make it a bit inconsistent. However, just playing 2 copies of Type Null and 2 Silvali and 2 Gladion is kind of better than just playing 1 copy of Type Null and Silvali and not playing Gladion, so that's kind of why people have done this. 2 research, of course, needed. 1 Mars, 1 Sabrina. These are supporter cards that we can kind of play at any given time. And then 1 Lily, which I think is also kind of non-negotiable when we're playing Charizard. You might be able to cut Charmeleon here for a Giant Cape, but this is just an example of a list that did quite well recently, so I wanted to showcase it here in this particular video. It's Charizard, not much else we can say about it. Still pretty good in the format, inconsistent, so its average win rates, especially in tournaments, have not been that high. But in terms of like a grinding ranked battles deck, especially when win streaks come into the format, I know the format will change, but Charizard will likely be a really strong win streak deck, just in case you get lucky for a few games. So keep that in mind. Still a pretty decent choice here. Not something that I would necessarily choose, as much as maybe some other decks that we're going to be showcasing in this video, but still a really strong deck. So I do believe this is the best Charizard deck in Pokemon Pocket right now. For those of you that wanted to play Charizard, here you go. Next up is going to be the last Silvali deck that I would recommend, and that is actually going to be Bosephilon. So Bosephilon Silvali is also a very, very interesting deck. We are playing 2 copies of Leaf here because leading off with Bosephilon is quite bad. Now, the one upside to this particular strategy is that Leaf does actually count towards that particular condition with the Brave Buddies attack with Silvali. So we can Leaf for the turn and then go into Silvali and do that full damage. So most of the time, playing a leadoff Pokemon that's not good and then being forced to play 2 copies of Leaf is inherently a downside to your list. However, because Leaf does kind of fit the condition for Silvali, it kind of makes it a little bit less bad, I guess. It doesn't feel as bad to play Leaf, go into Silvali, because then you do the full damage here. This really is a Silvali deck, very similar to the Turbo Silvali, but just much less consistent. However, we are doing massive damage with Bosephilon here and Rocky Helmet. This is a deck list that's really all about setting up your Bosephilon in the mid to late game and then taking big one-hit KOs across a lot of different Pokemon in the format. Going to be strong, again, against Solgaleo, against Gueritina and Darkrai, also against Buzzwole. So that is a big upside to this deck, is that we are fire, so we are hitting for weakness on a couple of relevant Pokemon. But the 130 damage from Bosephilon plus Rocky Helmet damage and any damage we're doing with Silvali will be enough to really take KOs across any Pokemon in the game. We're not playing any further kind of damage modification here. The main reason for that is that most of the time we're going to be playing Lusamine on that turn. So the way that we're modifying or increasing the damage we're doing with Bosephilon really is through using Rocky Helmet. Bosephilon's a Pokemon that's going to get KO'd after you attack anyway. However, it leaves you with 30 HP, which is, again, somewhat relevant because Rocky Helmet, does sort of go into effect. So this is a deck that's going to be able to tie a lot of games, which is pretty cool. But again, it is a deck that's a bit reliant on, getting the correct start off, and you're not always going to. 2 copies of Bosephilon, 2 copies of Leaf. So we have a 50-50 chance of leading with Bosephilon in the active spot, which is definitely something that could cost you a game. And if we don't draw into Leaf, of course, that's going to be a very tough strategy for you. Now, theoretically, you can just attach to Bosephilon and maybe get an attack off, but you don't have a lot of HP, and the format right now is fairly fast-paced, especially with Silvali in the format, so not something that you really want to be doing. This is definitely a less consistent version of Silvali. However, I will say it's probably more consistent than Charizard, but doesn't have necessarily as high of an upside as Charizard. Charizard does. We are a bit reliant on, of course, that Lusamine Bosephilon combination later in the game. But other than that, it's Silvali. So it's going to be good enough, I think, into a lot of decks of the format. Going second with Silvali, you always have a good chance. So for those of you that wanted to play sort of another kind of less common version of Silvali, this is not honestly a pretty decent option for you. I like Bosephilon. It's a little bit more common at the higher ranks, not something that's really kind of picked up in pace in tournament play that much. Again, it's less of a high roll deck, more of a consistent sort of late game strong attacker deck, which again is really good against multi-prize Pokemon like EX Pokemon that we can KO with Bosephilon and take multiple points in one turn. Against all purely single prize archetypes, it's probably going to struggle a little bit, and like I said, less consistent than the Turbo Electric type Silvali deck. So here you go. Silvali Bosephilon, I think it's still a pretty good option. Probably better in the higher ranks of Master Ball to specific counterplay other decks that people are playing, but certainly not a bad deck. So here you go, Silvali Bosephilon. Silvali is just probably the best Pokemon in the game right now, if not one of them. So I really think that as long as you're playing Silvali, you're probably gonna have a pretty decent chance. And yeah, here you go. All right, guys. And next up is, wait a minute, what is this? What do we got here on the screen? Shameless plug here. Listen, 70% of you guys that watch my videos over the last 28 days are not subscribed to the channel. So if that is one of you, I would highly recommend that you hit that subscribe button. We're getting close to 25,000 subscribers, so I would really appreciate the support. Thank you guys so much for watching the videos. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed them. And if you wanted to support me or support the channel, hitting that subscribe button would mean a lot. I bet a lot of you guys watch my videos and don't realize that you're not subscribed. So again, go ahead and check. If you're not, hit that subscribe button. I really do appreciate it. All right, guys, let's move on from here. Next up, we've got Gueritina and Darkrai. Now, I actually do believe this is one of the few scenarios that playing Gueritina Darkrai in tournaments and playing it in ranked battles does kind of warrant playing the list a little bit differently. Now, this is kind of definitely a topic of debate. Typically, tournament decks and ranked battle decks aren't very different. Gueritina Darkrai has two main ways in which we can play it. For tournaments, I do think the best way to play Gueritina Darkrai is just not with Nihilego and playing it just straight up Gueritina and Darkrai, 2 copies of each, and then playing the extra hand disruption. Now, if we're playing on the ranked ladder, there's certainly going to be quite a bit of Oricorio decks and a variety of other matchups where I do think that the Poison Barb Nihilego combination is actually quite good. Basically, the whole idea here is that combined with Poison Barb and the poison damage from Nihilego, plus the Nightmare Aura damage that we're doing with Darkrai, should be enough for us to not lose to those Oricorio decks, especially because the most common Oricorio decks are really only playing 1 copy of Oricorio, so this should be enough for us to counterplay that particular matchup. Overall, I think this deck list is a little bit less consistent than the other version, which is, of course, not playing Nihilego, but I still think it's a pretty good option. So, yeah, in ranked battles, this is actually the list that I would recommend, strangely enough, but in tournaments, I would probably not run Nihilego just because you'd rather just sort of try to get lucky, play a better deck and get a little bit more lucky with your matchups. In ranked battles at a very large sample size, inevitably you are going to run into quite a few of Oricorios, so it's better to kind of account for that matchup than not. So for ranked battles, this would be the version of Darkrai and Gueritina that I would play. Again, 1 copy of Nihilego, that's going to boost the damage that your opponent takes from poison every turn. Poison Barbs is going to poison your opponent. Let's hope you don't get Guzman. And then, of course, we still have a ton of room in the deck for all of the other really useful cards, like 2 Pokemon Center Lady, Research, Guzma, Cyrus, Mars, Leaf, and Sabrina, and 1 copy of Red Card. So 1 Mars, 1 Red Card, still some hand disruption in this deck, which I think is a very important factor of Gueritina and Darkrai. The one scary part about this particular deck is, of course, the prize, or I guess the point trading and the math and how that works out, right? So Nihilego is a single prize Pokemon that's very easy to KO. It only has 70 HP. So if this thing does get caught into the active spot, it can definitely be a liability for your opponent to win the game much easier. Of course, with things like Pheromosa and Buzzwole, it's a little bit more common for them to do that. However, we do, of course, have 2 Pokemon Center Ladies. So if they do target Nihilego, we can, of course, keep it up to high HP so they cannot play Cyrus. And hopefully we get multiple Darkrai's and Gueritinas on our bench so that they can't Sabrina us for a game. You want to force your opponent to KO maybe a Gueritina and a Darkrai, so that's definitely one of the more inconsistent aspects of Nihilego. But like I said, covering that Oricorio matchup is going to be a little bit more important if we are, of course, playing a lot of games in ranked mode. You're just going to end up hitting some Oricorio, so I think that this is probably going to be the better version for you if you are playing in ranked battles. And I honestly think Gueritina Darkrai is a top-tier choice still. Very consistent. This is kind of the opposite of the Charizard deck, where it doesn't have as much of like an upside, but it's a very consistent deck, so it's always and almost always going to be doing what you want it to do. Whether that's enough to win the game or not really depends on what your opponent draws, but again, with hand disruption, we are allowed to, I guess, sort of disrupt our opponent and maybe slow them down a little bit. That's the core strategy with Gueritina and Darkrai. Some people have put Darktina here in the S tier, And I don't know if I'm really fully committed to S tier and Gueritina Darkrai. However, it did win the first Ursa Days tournament of this format. It's something that's actually gotten better as time has gone on, which is interestingly enough. But yeah, it's still a really strong deck. So this would be definitely one of my top 7 recommendations if you're playing on the ranked battles ladder. Now, I did play a couple games on stream recently with Gueritina Darkrai, and I misplayed every single game. So it's not something I'm particularly fond of or comfortable with, but certainly a very, very strong deck. So I had to go ahead and recommend it. The Nihilego combo, probably better for ranked mode. Next up, we've got Solgaleo. So here's the thing with Solgaleo is that I think it is potentially an S tier deck in the format. It just is a deck that just does what it wants to do, right? There's very few ways for you to really counterplay Solgaleo. Yes, some hand disruption can make it a bit better, but there's going to be those games where Solgaleo goes up, it evolves, turn 2 Rare Candy, and just starts attacking for Soul Breaker 120. And that feels very, very, very bad. That's partly why we're playing Giant Cape in the Silvali decks, and it's a big reason why we're playing Hand Disruption in a variety of decks in the format right now. This deck list is all about using Shiinotic to get into Solgaleo more consistently. Getting 2 Solgaleo set up is really, really strong. This is a deck that's going to struggle a little bit against Charizard because Charizard can KO you. Same with like the Bosephilon. It's kind of the big reason in my mind why the fire decks are seeing play is because not only is Buzzwole popular, but Solgaleo is also popular. And of course, we are able to hit for weakness on Solgaleo, so that is pretty relevant. But Oricorio is also something that kind of counters Solgaleo. Now, there is an interesting scenario that can happen if you, of course, don't have, if you're in a particular board state playing Oricorio against Solgaleo, they can kind of just go into Cosmium and then stiffen turn after turn. And then eventually the game just ends in a tie because you don't have any way to kind of take any more KOs. So that is a potential win condition, or not win condition, but a not lose condition when you're playing the Solgaleo Oricorio matchup. So you want to keep that in mind. You definitely want to keep some of your, cards available to you to potentially win that matchup. You want to maybe keep a Silvali alive. That matchup is particularly in favor of Oricorio. However, one thing I will say is that Solgaleo always has the potential to win. This is kind of what we call a solitaire deck, and it's not, I'm not dissing this deck, I'm not talking down to it, but the reality is when you're playing Solgaleo EX, you're kind of doing the same stuff every single game. It doesn't really matter what your opponent is playing or what deck you're going up against. So Solgaleo just kind of does the same thing every game, which is good from a consistency standpoint. I think a lot of people disregard the aspects of how many times they misplay and how often they lose because of misplay. Solgaleo is a deck where you're probably going to misplay maybe less. There is some sequencing stuff to get down with this deck, and of course, it is definitely an RNG deck, but for the most part, fairly simple to play. I think Solgaleo is honestly a really, really strong deck, which is kind of funny if we think about it, because Solgaleo was actually the most common deck in ranked battles of last format, as the developers have given us the data. But last format, I actually thought Solgaleo wasn't even a great deck. I thought it was like a B or C tier deck last format, which is funny because it was the most played deck. This format, I don't think it's the most played deck, but it's probably one of the best decks. So it's really, really funny. Not enough people are watching the channel is what that tells me, honestly. But no, anyway, here's Solgaleo. 1 copy of Red. I do think Red is actually better than Guzma in this particular deck. That's my own opinion. There's enough matchups where doing 140 with Red is kind of more relevant. So I would play 1 copy of Red instead of Guzma in this list. That's my preference. You could swap Red for Guzma. Everything else in the list I think is pretty standard, kind of non-negotiable. Again, we're seeing 1 copy of Mars in almost every deck, and I think even in ranked battles, Mars is definitely worth it. In the late game, dropping your opponent down to 1 or 2 cards in hand is kind of the best chance you have oftentimes to win in the late game. So yeah, 1 copy of Mars. Here's Solgaleo. Not much else we can really say about it. Really, really strong deck. It is what it is. There is one particular tech that I would maybe recommend to people. If you are in the Solgaleo mirror match, sometimes it's actually better to not evolve into Solgaleo, go into Cosmium, and then stiffen if you have Lily in hand, because then effectively it kind of reverse Uno cards the turn order on your opponent, and then technically you get the first attack off on their Solgaleo. So that's a very interesting scenario. I don't know if that made sense to you guys, but theoretically speaking, if you evolve into Solgaleo and then you attack, or if you evolve into Solgaleo and you can attack, it's definitely going to be a little bit of a struggle. So you can go into Cosmium and then stiffen, and then if you have Lily in hand, you can kind of recover and then technically get the first attack on your opponent and turn things around. That is certainly a scenario that can win games in the mirror matchup. That's something I don't know if many people talk about. But anyway, if that made sense to you guys, hopefully it did. I don't know. But anyway, Solgaleo. We got to recommend it because it's still a strong deck. Okay. next up are going to be kind of my two top decks, actually, going into ranked battles right now in this sort of third week of the format. Here is an updated Buzzwole deck, because I do believe that Buzzwole is still the best deck in Pokemon Pocket right now. I know we just sort of talked about Silvali, Turbo Silvali. I think Turbo Silvali is phenomenal, but Buzzwole in general is just so good. This entire archetype is absolutely broken. This is a funny list. I guess funny, but it's interesting in the sense that we've talked about two different versions of Buzzwole for quite a while now, and what's kind of becoming more popular in the last sort of few days is this sort of really in-between version of Buzzwole. Before, we were playing 2 copies of Pheromosa, 2 Cyrus, and no Kartana, and we were really leaning into the Cyrus-Pheromosa combo. The other deck lists were playing 2 Kartana and maybe 1 Pheromosa with some hand disruption, maybe Rocky Helmets and some other techs. This deck list is sort of that in-between here that's kind of middling, and I think it's becoming a little bit more common. I do quite like this deck right now, and it kind of encompasses a little bit of both worlds. 2 Pheromosa and 1 Kartana, so we are playing at least 1 copy of both. We still have 1 Cyrus, but we're playing 1 copy of Repel. I've been a believer in Repel. It's kind of fallen in and out of play for a variety of different decks, but I honestly do think Repel is still a really, really strong card. It's going to be good against Silvali. Sabrina does the same thing, but the upside with Repel as opposed to Silvali is that, or not Silvali, Sabrina, is that we can play Lusamine and Repel in the same turn. That is a win condition. We can, of course, Erica's and Repel in the same turn. That's also a win condition. Or we can play Research and draw into Repel and be able to play at that same turn. This deck list is playing all of that good stuff here. 1 Cyrus, 1 Repel, 1 Erica's, 2 Lusamine. I would recommend 2 Lusamine and Buzzwole. I always play 2 copies of Lusamine. I know some people only play 1, but anyway. 1 copy of Mars and 1 red card. So some hand disruption in here as well. Hand disruption in general is actually quite good, I think, in the format right now. Some people have some strong opinions, about it or against it, but one thing is for sure, most of the most successful decks that we see in Pokemon Pocket are playing hand disruption. It is just enough to kind of win the game. In general, I know like the math, there's all that math data and people talk about stuff, but one thing you got to keep in mind is that people make decisions based around their board state and the cards that are in their hand. And you don't know what cards that are in your hand, but your opponent does. So basically changing that aspect of the game for them and them not really knowing what cards are going to be in their hand is oftentimes an advantage for you. So inherently speaking, I know some of the math doesn't always check out, but in general, hand disruption has proven to be an effective strategy in competitive Pokemon Pocket. So there you go. Here's an updated Buzzwole deck. I know there's been so many different versions that we've shown here on the channel. It's changing every week. Honestly, I think the core Buzzwole is good enough to just try to win most of the time. And people are going to flip-flop in terms of what cards they're playing in the list. But in general, I don't think it really changes the flow of the deck that much. 1 Erica's is really good. 1 Cyrus is good. 2 Research, 2 Pokeball, of course. I think at least 1 copy of Pheromosa and Kartana is pretty relevant. And then 2 copies of Lusamine is kind of needed. This list is playing 2 Leaf Cape. We saw some people play Rocky Helmet. Some people play Giant Cape so that they can attach it to Celesteela. It really kind of depends. Honestly, it doesn't necessarily matter too much to me what cards we're playing here. I think at least 1 Leaf Cape is pretty relevant. A lot of decks are playing Guzma, so it honestly doesn't really come into play that often anyway. But anyway, guys, there it is. Here's an updated Buzzwole deck that's been doing pretty well recently, and I wanted to showcase it here on the channel. So next up is going to be kind of a surprise. Honestly, a deck that I am quite high on right now. And again, I'm not sort of trying to manipulate the meta to any scenario here, but I think that Turbo Silvali deck has really been on the rise recently. And I think that Oricorio certainly on the rise. And I think that this particular deck here, Guzzlord, is actually fairly well positioned against a lot of the top decks in the metagame. Guzzlord is really, really funny. The ability to discard energies with Grindcore as well as Team Rocket Grunt is actually really, really relevant early in the game. If we're going second, it's going to be good against Silvali. It's also really good against Charizard, and it can be good against Solgaleo, especially in the scenarios where we discard more than 1 energy. And Guzzlord is just inherently kind of broken. So this is a very simplified Guzzlord deck. The core of the strategy is to set up Guzzlord in the active spot, do some extra chip damage with Nihilego and Poison Barb, and then use Lusamine to set up a second Guzzlord to start clearing the game here with Tyrannical Hull. It's a really kind of solid strategy. Unfortunately, we are weak to Grass with Guzzlord, so against Buzzwole, the matchup's not going to be that great, especially because they also have Lusamine, so discarding energies is kind of less relevant. But honestly, other than Buzzwole, against a lot of the best decks and the most common decks in Pokemon Pocket, I actually think that Guzzlord has become quite good. In fact, it's one of my favorite Pokemon right now in the entire game. So this is going to be honestly kind of my top recommendation for ranked battles going into this week. Again, Solgaleo, not Solgaleo, but Silvali and Rampardos really declining in play. Charizard is increasing in play. Turbo Silvali increasing in play. Guzzlord has really ended up being quite a well-positioned deck in the current metagame. some people might have some, opinions about it, whether they think it's good or not. I've lost to Guzzlord and I've won with Guzzlord quite a bit. I know it's a Pokemon that hasn't really risen in terms of the most popular deck recently, but I actually do think that Guzzlord is kind of a top choice right now in the current metagame, at least top 3. So that's kind of what I wanted to, focus around at the end of this video, was talking about Guzzlord and how I think it's actually a lot bit better right now than it has been in previous weeks. So there you go, Guzzlord. I think it's underrated. I think it's been one of the better Pokemon in Pokemon Pocket over the last 3 weeks or so. And I think right now is as good of a time to play Guzzlord as any. So there you go, guys. There is Guzzlord. And this is the list that I would play. Naganadel sees play sometimes. I would recommend not playing Naganadel, playing a list like this, playing 1 Pokemon Center Lady, 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina, 1 Red Card, 1 Mars. So it's got a little bit of everything here. Poison Barb with a 2 Nihilego, and then 1 Team Rocket Grunt as sort of a, a last-ditch effort sometimes to win games, which it can. It definitely can, especially if you Team Rocket Grunt and you grind core in the same turn. 170, so we're living an attack from basically everything in the game right now, which is honestly very, very relevant. So I like Guzzlord. I really, really do. Really strong Pokemon, something I would definitely recommend. You're going to struggle against Buzzwole, but other than that, I think you're actually pretty well positioned. So anyway, there you go, guys. There's Guzzlord, and that's it. That's it for all of the decks this week. I know it's a quick video. I just kind of wanted to give a quick little update here as to what decks I would recommend playing in ranked mode in this next sort of week or so. We're going into the weekend. This weekend, we actually have multiple different large tournaments. I believe Godsley is running another tournament, and Ursidays has their tournament as well. So it should be a very, very interesting weekend of competition. I'm curious to see what decks do well. Meta Monday should be definitely very interesting, so I cannot wait to do that. And then, of course, we'll give our final tier list next week. And yeah, I believe it's been announced that the next set is coming out on the 26th, so we've got about 13 days until that happens, and we've got about 5 or 6 days until the announcement for that set comes, so you're going to want to stay tuned. We're going to cover all of that here on the channel. And yeah, I think that currently right now Pokemon Pocket's in an interesting position. I think that this is certainly the least amount of people that have been playing the game regularly than we really ever have had in Pokemon Pocket. That's just sort of the nature of the game. I think that the game has been declining, of course, since it was released. That's sort of how it goes. Ranked battles saw a little bit of a surge in play for the player base, and then I think that the rare candy stuff with Celestial Guardians definitely boosted the popularity around the game and the hype, but this set definitely things have died down a little bit, so I fully understand that. But honestly, guys, now is as good of a time as ever to be grinding in ranked battles and to potentially hit like top 1000. So I think it's definitely doable now. I'm really curious to see what the next set and the next expansion to Pokemon Pocket will be. Definitely going to be something really interesting in my mind. We'll see how the metagame changes. I'm really, really excited to see that. But anyway, guys, let's wrap up the video here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all of the support. Comment down below what you guys think of these decks. What have you been playing? Yeah, that's it. Let me know what you guys think, all right? Peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.